I have always been a collector, though not of anything typical like stamps or coins. My obsession is mirrors. They aren't just decorations to me. They are windows into forgotten times, pieces of art that hold stories only the observant can uncover. I love their ornate frames, their distinct shapes, the way each one seems to reflect not only the world, but a feeling. Sometimes warmth, sometimes cold, sometimes something I can't quite name. The collection started innocently enough, a dusty hand mirror found in an antique shop during a vacation. Its bronze frame was worn, the glass a little foggy, but there was something about it that called to me. When I looked into it, I felt like I could almost see someone else staring back. Not my own reflection, but someone from another time. That feeling stayed with me, an itch that only more mirrors could scratch. Over the years, my collection grew. Every room in my house held at least one, with my study boasting the largest, a dozen mirrors of varying sizes and shapes, positioned just so, each one casting its own unique reflection of the dimly lit room. Friends and family found it strange, even a little unnerving, but I didn't care. I loved the feeling of being surrounded by them, the sensation of being watched, as though the mirrors themselves were keeping me company. Tonight I stood in the center of my study, admiring my collection. The light from my desk lamp glowed softly, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I leaned in close to one of the older mirrors, a tall, narrow piece with an intricately carved wooden frame. The glass was slightly warped, giving my reflection an elongated, ghostly quality. I smiled at the distortion, but there was something unsettling about the way my eyes seemed to follow me even as I moved away. I shook off the feeling and turned towards my latest acquisition, still wrapped in an old, moth-eaten blanket on the floor. I couldn't wait to see it fully. This one was special. It had cost me more than I cared to admit, purchased from a seller who had been oddly eager to part with it. "Once you start, you cannot stop," the man had said with a nervous smile, practically begging me to take it. He thrust the mirror into my hands before I could ask any questions. The warning had been strange, but I brushed it off as the seller's attempt to add an air of mystery to justify the hefty price tag. I knelt down, carefully unwrapping the blanket. The mirror beneath was unlike any I had ever seen. The glass itself was almost black, reflecting only the faintest outline of my face. I felt a chill, a shiver that ran from the base of my spine up to my neck, but I couldn't look away. There was something about this mirror, something that demanded my attention, something that promised secrets if only I looked long enough. I took a deep breath, shaking off the growing unease. It was just a mirror after all. I thought I saw something move behind me in its dark reflection, a flicker of motion, like a shadow passing through the room. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the silent room and the dim reflections of my beloved mirrors, watching me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It all started with a phone call. A man named Victor, someone I'd never met, contacted me saying he had a mirror he was sure I'd be interested in. He mentioned my name as if he knew me, and rattled off details about my collection that he shouldn't have known, details that I had never shared publicly. I didn't ask how he knew. My curiosity got the better of me. Victor said the mirror was very old and rumored to have a dark history. He wouldn't tell me much over the phone, just enough to pique my interest. "You need to see it for yourself," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "This one is different." The cryptic nature of the call, combined with my own fascination, meant I didn't hesitate for long. We arranged a meeting at an estate not far from town, a place I had never been. When I arrived, the house was exactly as I had imagined, a sprawling estate, long forgotten by time. Ivy crawled up the stone walls and the windows were clouded with dust. Victor met me at the door, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and trembling hands. He led me inside without a word, through a maze of hallways and cluttered rooms. The place was filled with old furniture, paintings, and relics that seemed to belong to a different century. Finally, we reached a small, dimly lit room at the back of the house. There, standing against the wall, was the mirror. It was larger than any I had seen before, with a dark, almost oppressive presence. The frame was made of a wood so dark it was nearly black, covered in carvings that were difficult to make out in the poor light. As I stepped closer, I saw the carvings were of faces, twisted, anguished faces, each one different from the next. The glass was smoky, dark, obscuring my reflection almost entirely, as though it were hiding something behind the surface. Victor stayed silent as I examined it, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "They say it shows you what you truly fear," he said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "That's why the last owner got rid of it. He couldn't bear to look at it anymore." I should have felt a pang of hesitation, but instead I felt drawn to it, an inexplicable need to take it home. It was as if the mirror was calling to me, and I knew I couldn't leave without it. The transaction was quick. Victor seemed almost desperate to be rid of it. As I loaded it into my car, he gave me one last warning. "Be careful. It's not like the others." I didn't ask what he meant. I was too captivated by the mirror, too eager to add it to my collection. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at it, wrapped securely in the back seat. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the reflection, a flicker, like someone shifting in the darkness. I blinked and it was gone, but the unease lingered. By the time I got home, the excitement had taken over any lingering doubts. This mirror would be the centerpiece of my collection, I was sure of it. I carried it inside, feeling its weight, both physical and something more. Something that seemed to press down on me, heavy and cold. I placed it in the study, right in the center, and stepped back to admire it. As I looked at the mirror, the room seemed to grow colder. The faces on the frame almost appeared to shift in the dim light, and the glass remained stubbornly dark, refusing to show my reflection clearly. I felt a chill run through me, but I couldn't help but smile. This mirror was unlike any other, unique, mysterious, and exactly what I had been searching for. Whatever secrets it held, I was ready to uncover them. At first, everything was as it always was. The room filled with a comforting glow from my desk lamp, the other mirrors casting familiar reflections. But as the days went by, strange occurrences began to unfold. It started subtly, flickers of movement in the corners of my eyes. I would be sitting at my desk or walking through the study, and I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just out of sight. Each time I turned, expecting to see someone there, I found only empty space. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, tricks of light and shadow. But it began happening more frequently, and I started to feel an unease that was hard to ignore. The air in the room grew colder. The chill seemed to seep from the new mirror, sending shivers across my skin. I tried adjusting the thermostat, but it made no difference. The cold seemed isolated to the study, and only when I was near the mirror. At night, as I sat in the room, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. There were times when I swore I could see my breath, even though the rest of the house was warm. Then came the whispers. Soft, barely audible, they seemed to echo from nowhere, rising and falling just at the edge of my hearing. I would strain to make out the words, but they always remained just beyond comprehension. They were faint, like distant voices carried on the wind, but in the silence of the study, they were unmistakable. I couldn't tell if they were coming from the mirrors or from somewhere deeper, somewhere unseen. Instead of frightening me, these strange occurrences only intrigued me more. The new mirror had something different, something that set it apart from all the others. I found myself standing before it for hours, my eyes searching the dark glass for answers. The glass was still stubbornly black, reflecting only the faintest outline of myself, but I felt as though someone, was looking back at me. The obsession took hold in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself gravitating toward the study at all hours of the day, compelled to sit before the new mirror. It wasn't just a curiosity anymore, it was a need. Even when I tried to focus on other tasks, my thoughts drifted back to it. What was it hiding? Why did I feel like it wanted me there? One evening, as I sat in my study, the air grew unnaturally still. The faint whispers I'd grown accustomed to became sharper, like voices just behind a closed door. I leaned closer to the mirror, pressing my palms against the icy frame. "Who are you?" I whispered aloud, half expecting no answer. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, just as I was about to pull away, a single, chilling word emerged from the depths of the glass. "Closer." I froze. The voice was not my own, and yet seemed to echo within me. My heart raced, but instead of running, I leaned in further, my breath fogging the glass. As I stared, the dark surface rippled, as though disturbed by an unseen force. Faint outlines began to materialize, shadowy figures moving within the mirror, their forms indistinct, but undeniably human. I couldn't look away. The figures swayed and twisted, their movements unnatural, as though submerged in water. One figure broke from the rest, its outline sharpening. It reached out, a hand pressing against the glass from within. A cold shock jolted through me as I realized I was mirroring its gesture, my own hand now pressed against the glass. The barrier between us felt thin, almost fragile. I could feel a faint vibration, like the surface was alive. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, a grotesque parody of curiosity. Its hand seemed to push harder against the glass, and for a fleeting moment I thought the surface might break. Then, with a sudden jerk, it pulled back into the shadows, disappearing as though it had never been there. The room seemed to exhale, the whispers fading into the stillness. My hand was cold and damp, as though I had touched something not entirely solid. I staggered back, my breath coming in short gasps. The mirror stood as it always had, dark and inscrutable, but the lingering sense of something watching me was stronger than ever. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. I was captivated. Whatever this mirror was, whatever it wanted, I had to know more. The days blurred together, my focus entirely consumed by the mirror. It was as if time bent around it, drawing me closer, hour after hour. At first I was aware of my growing obsession, the way I'd lose hours simply staring into its depths. But soon I wasn't sure where my reflection ended and I began. The boundary between us grew thinner, almost non-existent. It started with small lapses. I'd enter the study and find myself already standing in front of the mirror, though I had no memory of crossing the room. Then I'd hear it, the faint hum, a low vibration that seemed to come from the glass itself. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as a trick of the mind, but the more time I spent near the mirror, the louder it became. One night, I woke in a cold sweat, my hands trembling as if they had been holding something heavy. The faint hum echoed in my ears, even though I was in bed, far from the study. I stumbled down the hallway, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. When I entered the study, the mirror was waiting, its surface darker than ever, rippling faintly like a disturbed pond. I approached cautiously, my breath hitching as the hum grew louder. The air felt thick, pressing down on me, making every step heavier than the last. When I finally reached the mirror, my reflection was gone. In its place was something else. A face stared back at me, twisted and contorted, its features just close enough to mine to be unsettling. Its eyes were hollow, deep voids that seemed to pull me in. As I reached out, unable to stop myself, the face mirrored my movement, its expression shifting to one of triumph. "You've seen me now," a voice echoed in my mind, low and resonant, as though the mirror itself was speaking. "There's no turning back." I staggered backward, the room spinning around me. The face in the mirror didn't disappear, it stayed watching me, its hollow eyes following every move. The hum grew deafening, a crescendo that threatened to split my skull. Then suddenly it stopped. The face vanished, leaving only my own pale, trembling reflection staring back. I collapsed into the nearest chair, gasping for air. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. Whatever was in that mirror had seen me, and worse, I had seen it. The connection between us was undeniable, and I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't finished with me yet. I began to notice the lapses more frequently. They started as fleeting moments, a skipped heartbeat where I'd blink and find myself somewhere unexpected, but soon they stretched longer. I'd glance at the clock, its hands ticking in steady rhythm, only to look back moments later and find hours gone. The mirror seemed to anchor me during these lapses. Whenever I came to, I'd be standing before it, my hands trembling and my breath uneven. At first I thought it was sleepwalking or stress, but the pull of the mirror had become undeniable. It wasn't just watching me, it was tethering me. One night, I awoke to the faint sound of glass creaking, like ice cracking under pressure. The sound was faint but distinct, and it drew me to the study. I found the mirror trembling slightly, its surface rippling like liquid under the strain of something unseen. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing the cold, vibrating surface. The moment I touched it, a surge of images flooded my mind. They were fragmented, chaotic, visions of places I'd never been and faces I didn't recognize. They were watching me from their side of the glass, their hollow eyes filled with a longing I couldn't understand. Among them, I saw fleeting glimpses of my own reflection, distorted and fractured, as if I were one of them. I stumbled back, my hand shaking. The whispers that followed weren't distant anymore. They were inside the room, surrounding me. Each word came from a different direction, none of them coherent, but all of them urgent. I turned in circles, trying to locate the source, but it was everywhere and nowhere. The mirror pulsed faintly, a heartbeat I could feel in my chest. The faces within it faded, but one remained longer than the rest. It wasn't hollow like the others, it was sharp, clear, and unsettlingly familiar. It was my face, staring back with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "Why?" I asked aloud, not knowing who or what I was speaking to. The reflection tilted its head, and the room seemed to shift, as though the walls were bending toward the mirror. A single word formed on its lips, though no sound came. "Stay." The pressure in the room lifted suddenly, and I fell to my knees, gasping. The mirror was still, its surface dark and inscrutable. But I knew, deep down, that I was no longer the only one bound to this place. Something had shifted, and it was waiting for me to understand. The sound of wood scraping against wood pulled me out of sleep, sharp and jarring in the silence of the night. My eyes snapped open, the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the blinds, casting long shadows across my bedroom. At first, I thought it was a dream, the remnants of some half-forgotten nightmare. But then I heard it again, a low, deliberate creak, as if something heavy was being dragged. I sat up, my heart pounding, every nerve in my body on edge. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but everything seemed still, normal. Until I saw it. The mirror, the one I had placed in the study, the one I never moved from its spot. It was here now, standing at the foot of my bed. Its dark, intricate frame loomed like a shadowed monument, the carved faces seeming to ride and twist in the dim light. The glass was black, reflecting nothing but the faint outline of the room behind it. I froze, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I knew I hadn't brought it here, I couldn't have, and yet there it stood, impossibly out of place, its presence dominating the room. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I tried to make sense of it. Had someone moved it? Had I done it in my sleep? The questions swirled in my mind, but none of them made sense. The study was down the hall, far from here, and the mirror was heavy, far too cumbersome for me to have dragged it without waking. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the cold floor biting against my bare feet. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the mirror. Each step felt like a battle, my instincts screaming at me to turn away, to leave the room and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know. As I drew closer, the glass seemed to shift, faint ripples breaking across its surface like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. I reached out, my hand trembling, and stopped just short of touching it. The air around the mirror was icy, colder than the rest of the room, and I could feel a faint vibration emanating from it, like a heartbeat. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, though the words felt hollow. The mirror's presence was undeniable, its weight pressing down on me like a physical force. And then as I stared in the dark glass, something moved. A flicker, faint but unmistakable, like a shadow shifting just beyond the edge of perception. My reflection was absent, replaced by the inky void that seemed to stretch infinitely behind the glass. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. The mirror remained still, silent, but its presence seemed to grow, filling the room with an unbearable tension. The carved faces on the frame seemed to watch me, their anguished expressions almost alive. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the mirror, waiting for it to do something, anything. But it remained as it was, a silent sentinel at the foot of my bed, its dark glass hiding whatever horrors lay within. By morning, the mirror was gone. I found it back in the study, exactly where it had been before, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had brought it to my room, something that wanted me to see it, to acknowledge it. I don't remember when it started, but at some point, the reflections in the mirror changed. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a faint shadow that didn't match the angle of the light. I chalked it up to exhaustion or my overactive imagination. But as the days passed, the flickers became harder to ignore. They weren't tricks of the light, they were something else. The first time I truly saw it, I was sitting at my desk facing the mirror. The room was still, save for the faint hum that now seemed ever present. As I leaned forward to examine the dark glass, my own reflection stared back, distorted and faint in the inky surface. But then, just behind me, a shape moved. A slow, deliberate motion, like someone stepping closer. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and my reflection was unchanged, alone. For a moment, I questioned what I had seen. Was it real, or was the mirror playing with me? The next time, it was unmistakable. I was standing directly in front of the mirror, examining the intricate carvings on its frame. The faces, twisted, anguished, seemed almost alive in the dim light. My reflection stood where it should, perfectly aligned with my movements. But as I leaned in closer, a second reflection appeared, faint and murky, just over my shoulder. It wasn't mine. The figure was tall, its head slightly tilted, its features grotesquely elongated as if pressed against the glass. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it, its presence radiating from the mirror like a cold breath on the back of my neck. Slowly, I reached out to touch the glass, my fingers trembling. As soon as they met the icy surface, the figure vanished, leaving only my wide-eyed reflection staring back. From that moment, the figure became a constant presence. I would catch glimpses of it in the corners of the mirror, its form clearer each time. The more I watched, the more it seemed to take shape, its arms long and spindly, its head crowned with jagged, unnatural angles. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow voids that seemed to see through me, into me. The more time I spent in front of the mirror, the stronger its presence became. The figure no longer lingered in the edges of the glass. It stood directly behind me, watching. I began to feel its weight in the room, an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. Yet, I couldn't stay away. Something about the figure drew me in, like a moth to a flame. One night, as I sat before the mirror, the figure's reflection grew startlingly vivid. Its skin was pallid, almost translucent, stretched taut over its grotesque features. It tilted its head, mimicking my movements, as if mocking me. My stomach churned, but I couldn't look away. It wanted me to see it, to acknowledge it. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. "What do you want?" I whispered. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one of its long skeletal hands and pressed it against the inside of the glass. The surface rippled like water beneath its touch. I felt a jolt, like static electricity, race up my arm as if it had reached out to me through the mirror. I recoiled, falling back into my chair, gasping for air. The mirror went still. The figure remained, its hand pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes fixed on me. And then, As if it had been there all along, a faint whisper filled the room. "You see me now." The voice wasn't loud, but it resonated deep within me, cold and hollow. The words echoed in my mind long after the figure faded back into the depths of the mirror, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the creeping realization that this was far from over. I don't know when the fear became fascination, when the terror turned into something like hunger. But I couldn't stop. Every night, I found myself drawn back to the study, the mirror an irresistible anchor that pulled me from the safety of my bed. The whispers were louder now, distinct words breaking through the constant hum, though they were too faint to understand. Still, I listened, hoping for a clue, a secret I could grasp. The figure, now a permanent resident of the mirror, seemed aware of my desperation. It no longer lurked in the shadows of the glass. It stood boldly, its grotesque form fully visible. The jagged contours of its face, the impossibly long limbs, the hollow voids where its eyes should be, all of it was burned into my mind. And yet, I couldn't look away. There was power in its presence, an ancient, raw energy that seemed to seep through the glass. I began to speak to it. At first, it was just whispers, tentative questions uttered in the dead of night. "What are you?" I'd ask, or "Why are you here?" It never responded, but the air around the mirror seemed to shift when I spoke, as if the entity was listening, considering. My obsession grew. I spent hours in the study, my life outside the mirror slipping away. Work, friends, sleep, all of it became secondary. The mirror was my world now, the entity my only companion. I filled notebooks with theories, diagrams of the carvings on the frame, fragmented thoughts about what the entity might be. It wasn't just a reflection. It was something more, something that had lived before and could live again. One night, as I sat before the mirror, I decided to push further. "You want something from me," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "Tell me what it is. Let me help you." The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. The room grew colder, the whispers rising into a frantic chorus that seemed to come from every corner of the study. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned closer, desperate for a response. "Show me," I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. "Show me what you want." For the first time, the figure moved. Its hand, long and skeletal, pressed against the inside of the glass, the surface rippling like water under its touch. Slowly, deliberately, it pointed at me. A chill ran through me, but I didn't move. "I don't understand," I said. "What do you mean?" The whispers grew louder, a cacophony that seemed to echo inside my skull. The figure didn't move again, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. My chest tightened as I struggled to breathe, my vision blurring at the edges. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The room was silent, the air thick with an unspoken tension. The figure remained, its hand still pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes unblinking. I stared at it, my heart pounding, my mind racing with questions. What did it want from me? What was I supposed to do? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stop. The mirror held something I needed to understand, a truth that felt just out of reach. Whatever it took, I would find out what it was. It was Amanda who noticed first. We'd been friends for years, and while we drifted apart recently, she still checked in from time to time. When I stopped answering texts, she came over unannounced, knocking insistently at my front door until I let her in. I tried to keep her out of the study, but she was persistent, her sharp eyes taking in my disheveled appearance and the dark circles under my eyes. "What's going on with you, George?" she asked, crossing her arms as she stepped into the living room. "You look like you haven't slept in days." "I'm fine," I lied, avoiding her gaze. "Just busy." "Busy doing what? Ignoring everyone who cares about you?" she shot back. Her tone was firm, but there was worry beneath the anger. "Something's wrong. I can see it." I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. How could I explain the mirror, the figure, the whispers? She'd think I was insane. But Amanda was relentless, and before I knew it, she was pushing past me, heading toward the hallway. "Amanda, wait!" I called, but it was too late. She'd found the study. The moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, heavier, and the faint hum that I'd grown accustomed to seemed to rise in pitch, as if the mirror itself were reacting to her presence. Amanda stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening as they fell on the mirror. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just a mirror," I said quickly, though even I didn't believe my own words. She turned to look at me, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "George, this isn't normal. That thing, it feels wrong." "I know," I admitted, my voice trembling, "but I can't get rid of it. It's important." "Important," she repeated, her brows furrowing. "You're scaring me. This isn't like you." Before I could respond, Amanda took a step closer to the mirror. "Don't," I said sharply, but she ignored me, her attention fixed on the dark glass. "George, there's something in there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached out, her hand hovering inches from the surface. "It's moving." "Amanda, stop!" I shouted, lunging forward to pull her away. But the moment her fingers brushed the glass, the room erupted in a deafening roar. The whispers turned into a cacophony, the mirror rippling violently as if it were alive. Amanda screamed, her body rigid as she was pulled toward the glass. I grabbed her arm, trying to yank her back, but it was like pulling against a tidal wave. The mirror's surface seemed to stretch, swallowing her hand, her arm, her shoulder. Her terrified eyes met mine, and she managed to choke out one final word: "Help." And then she was gone. The room fell silent, the mirror's surface stilled, dark and inscrutable. I stared at it, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. Amanda's reflection appeared in the glass, her face frozen in an expression of fear, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was trapped, just like the others I'd seen glimpses of before. I sank to the floor, my mind reeling. She'd tried to help me, and now she was part of it, part of whatever horror the mirror held. The figure's shadow loomed behind her reflection, its hollow eyes watching me with what I could only describe as satisfaction. I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Amanda was in there. I had to understand. I had to find a way to bring her back. The whispers began just after midnight. At first they were faint, barely distinguishable from the hum of the mirror that had become a constant presence in my life. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more distinct, their tone urgent, and this time they were calling my name. "George." The sound sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the way my name was spoken, low and guttural, but the way it seemed to echo from within the walls, as if the house itself were speaking to me. I sat upright in bed, my heart racing, the air around me suddenly cold and oppressive. "George, come." The voice was closer now, emanating from the hallway. I didn't think to question it. I simply got out of bed, my feet moving before my mind could catch up. The house was dark, the faint glow from the study spilling into the corridor like a beacon. I followed the light, my pulse quickening with each step. When I reached the study, the whispers stopped. The room was eerily silent, the air thick with anticipation. The mirror stood at the center of the room, its dark glass rippling faintly as if stirred by an unseen wind. And there, pressed against the surface, was the entity. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer a fleeting glimpse in the corner of my eye. It was fully visible now, its grotesque form leaning against the inside of the glass, as if it could step through at any moment. The jagged contours of its face were sharper than ever, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, with an intensity that made my chest tighten. Its body was a twisted amalgamation of sharp angles and unnatural curves, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in claws that scratched lightly against the glass. The sound was unbearable, a grating screech that set my teeth on edge. But I couldn't look away. It was as if the mirror had rooted me to the spot, holding me in place as the entity pressed closer. "George," it whispered again, the sound vibrating through the room. The voice was layered, as if a dozen others were speaking in unison, their tones ranging from soft and pleading to harsh and commanding. You're so close. I took an involuntary step forward, my breath fogging the glass. The entity's head tilted, its clawed hand reaching up to press against the inside of the mirror. The surface rippled beneath its touch, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw Amanda's face flash in the background, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. The entity's features twisted into something that might have been a smile, though it was impossible to tell. Its claws tapped against the glass in a rhythmic pattern, the sound echoing like a heartbeat. "You," it said, the single word filling the room with a cold finality. The glass began to shimmer, the reflections around the room warping and distorting as if reality itself were bending under the weight of the entity's presence. I tried to step back, to break free of whatever force was holding me there, but my body refused to move. My hands trembled as I raised them, instinctively reaching toward the glass, unable to stop myself. The entity's hand mirrored mine, our fingertips separated by only the thinnest barrier of rippling glass. The room grew darker, the light from the desk lamp flickering and dimming until the only illumination came from the mirror itself, a cold, unnatural glow that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. "It's time," the entity said, its voice softer now, almost soothing. "Let me show you." The glass beneath my fingers felt impossibly cold, and as I pressed my hand against it, the surface seemed to give way, pulling me closer. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me as the whispers returned, louder than ever, a chaotic symphony that threatened to drown out my thoughts. And then everything went silent. The mirror's surface stilled, the entity's form frozen, its hollow eyes boring into mine. I could feel the weight of its gaze, the cold seeping into my bones, and I knew, whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. The first crack was almost imperceptible, a faint sound like ice fracturing in the dead of winter. It echoed through the study, sharp and brittle, drawing my eyes to the mirror. A thin fracture had appeared across the glass, jagged and glimmering in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as the entity tilted its head, its claws pressing harder against the surface. Another crack split the mirror, then another, each one louder than the last. The fractures spread like a web, crisscrossing the glass until it seemed the mirror would collapse entirely. But instead of breaking apart, the shards began to ooze. Thick, inky darkness seeped from the cracks, dripping onto the floor in viscous, slow-moving pools. I stumbled backward, the back of my knees hitting the edge of the desk. The darkness flowed with a purpose, pooling at the base of the mirror before spreading outward like a living thing. The entity's claws scraped against the glass one final time before it pushed forward, its grotesque form emerging from the shards as if peeling itself from the surface. The process was slow, deliberate. Its head came first, angular and wrong, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The rest of its body followed, limbs twisting unnaturally as it stepped out of the mirror and onto the floor. The air grew colder with each movement, the room suffused with a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. The mirror itself continued to bleed, the inky substance clinging to the entity's body as it fully emerged. Its form was sharper now, more defined, its jagged edges shimmering faintly in the dim light. The claws on its hands flexed, each movement accompanied by a sound like steel scraping against stone. I tried to move, to run, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the creature as it straightened to its full height. It towered over me, its presence overwhelming, its hollow gaze fixed squarely on mine. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the room with a chaotic symphony of voices. "George," the entity said, its voice resonating through the study. "You've opened the door. Now, step through." I shook my head, my body trembling. What are you?" I managed to stammer, though my voice was barely audible over the din. The entity didn't answer. Instead, it extended one of its clawed hands toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. The darkness on the floor surged forward, curling around my ankles like tendrils, cold and unyielding. I gasped, struggling against it, but the inky substance held me firmly in place. The entity leaned closer, its hollow eyes mere inches from mine. "It's time," it whispered, the words vibrating through my very core. "You belong to me now." The mirror behind it shimmered, the fractures glowing faintly as the darkness continued to bleed. The shards seemed to pulse, drawing my gaze, pulling me deeper into the abyss. And as the entity's claws brushed against my shoulder, I realized there was no escape. The entity was fully free now, its grotesque form towering above me in the dim light of the study. It moved with an eerie fluidity, its jagged limbs slicing through the air as if reality itself bent around it. For the first time since this began, I felt something I hadn't truly felt before. Fear. Real, unrelenting fear. The kind that grips your chest and leaves you gasping for air. It turned its hollow eyes toward me, and though its face was expressionless, I could feel its malice. There was no need for words, its presence alone spoke volumes. My knees buckled, and I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The mirror, now shattered but still intact in some impossible way, pulsed with the same inky darkness that clung to the entity like a second skin. And then the realization struck me, sharp and undeniable. The mirrors, all of them. Every antique piece, every warped surface I had collected over the years. I wasn't just drawn to them, I was assembling them piece by piece. I had been freeing it. The thought hit me like a physical blow. The carvings on the frames, the faint shadows that had always seemed to linger in the glass, they weren't just decorations or imperfections. They were fragments of this thing, scattered and dormant until I brought them together. The entity tilted its head, as if it could hear my thoughts. Its hollow eyes burned with something that might have been amusement or triumph. "You've done well," it said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "I couldn't have done it without you." I shook my head, backing further into the corner of the room. "No," I whispered, though the denial felt hollow even as I said it. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." The entity took a step closer, its clawed feet leaving scorch marks on the wooden floor. The room seemed to darken around it, the shadows deepening until only its form remained illuminated by the faint, pulsing glow of the fractured mirror. "But you did," it said. "Every mirror, every moment, you opened the door, and now..." It reached out, one long skeletal hand hovering inches from my face. "You will see." I tried to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there frozen, but my body refused to obey. The air around me grew colder, heavier, as the darkness from the mirror began to creep toward me, curling around my ankles like living tendrils. My mind raced, fragments of memory flashing before my eyes. The first mirror, the warped reflections, the seller's cryptic warnings. It had all been leading to this. The entity's fingers brushed against my temple, and the world seemed to implode. A wave of cold darkness surged through me, filling every corner of my mind, my soul. I wasn't just staring at the entity anymore, I was part of it. I could feel its essence, its purpose, its hunger. And worst of all, I understood. It had been trapped for so long, scattered and fragmented, waiting for someone to piece it back together. And I, in my obsession, had done exactly that. My collection wasn't just a hobby, it was a ritual, a key. The entity leaned closer, its hollow eyes boring into mine. "Do you see now, George?" it whispered, its voice like a chorus of the damned. "Do you understand what you've done?" Tears streamed down my face as I nodded, unable to look away. "I'm sorry," I choked out, though I knew it meant nothing. The entity's twisted mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "Sorry?" it echoed, its tone mocking. "This is not the end, George. This is just the beginning." The mirror behind it pulsed one final time, the shards glowing faintly as they began to dissolve into the darkness. The entity's clawed hand extended fully, and as it reached out, I found myself paralyzed, unable to move. My body was frozen, my breath shallow and panicked. Its fingers hovered just above my chest. Suddenly, everything went dark. The last thing I saw before the void consumed me was my own reflection, twisted and distorted, staring back at me from the inky surface of the mirror. My face, but not mine. My eyes, but hollow. And then there was nothing. When I opened my eyes, everything was wrong. I wasn't in my study anymore. The familiar clutter, the bookshelves, the dim glow of the desk lamp, all of it was gone. Instead, I was surrounded by darkness, a cold, infinite void that pressed in from all sides. Yet I wasn't floating or falling. I was standing, though I couldn't feel the floor beneath my feet. I turned my head, or at least I thought I did. The sensation was strange, as though I were moving through thick syrup. Then slowly the world began to take shape. Shapes emerged from the void, angular and distorted, their edges sharp and unnatural. Reflections, countless reflections, stretching into the abyss, all of them staring back at me. At first, I thought I was alone, but as I strained to focus on the reflections, I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, their expressions frozen in silent anguish. They were etched into the edges of the reflections, carved into the very fabric of the darkness. And then I realized they weren't just faces, they were people. My chest tightened as I stepped forward, my movements sluggish and disjointed. The reflections moved with me, but my body did not feel like my own. I reached out, my hand pressing against what felt like cold glass. The surface rippled under my touch, and the face staring back at me mirrored the motion exactly. My face, my reflection, but it wasn't right. The eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to pull the light from the space around them. My features were twisted, my mouth locked in a permanent expression of fear and despair. I stumbled back, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, though the sound seemed muted, as though it couldn't escape this prison. "Help me," I tried to shout, but the words didn't form. The sound echoed back at me, faint and distorted, as if the void itself were mocking my plea. And then I saw it. Behind my reflection, the entity stood towering and grotesque, its hollow eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. It wasn't trapped anymore. It was free, standing in my study, in my world, my body. I watched as it moved, its clawed hands brushing against the bookshelves, its jagged limbs casting long shadows on the walls I had once known so well. And then it turned, staring directly at me, or rather, at the mirror where I was now imprisoned. For a fleeting moment, I thought it could see me. Its head tilted, and its lips curved into that mockery of a smile. But it didn't speak. It didn't need to. The message was clear. I had traded places with it, and there was no going back. As the entity stepped away, the reflections around me shifted. I wasn't alone in this prison. The faces etched into the mirror's frame began to stir, their hollow eyes flickering with faint recognition. They turned toward me, their mouths moving silently, their anguish palpable even without sound. I was one of them now, a new addition to the countless souls trapped in this endless void. My study, my collection, my life, they were all gone. And the entity, wearing my face, was free to continue its work. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed in was my distorted reflection staring back at me, its hollow eyes unblinking, a silent scream frozen on its face. The antique shop was quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. Dust motes drifted lazily in the faint streams of sunlight, filtering through the dirty windows, and the faint smell of aged wood and musty fabric lingered in the air. It was the perfect setting for the mirror to blend in, unassuming yet impossible to ignore for anyone who truly looked. A young couple strolled through the shop, their fingers brushing against the forgotten relics of another era. They laughed softly as they examined tarnished jewelry and faded paintings, their curiosity leading them deeper into the maze of shelves and cluttered aisles. Then they saw it. "Oh, look at this," the woman said, her voice tinged with fascination. She pointed to the mirror, its intricate frame carved with what seemed to be ancient designs. The carvings had an unsettling beauty to them, each face twisted in a silent scream, their eyes hollow and haunting. Her partner hesitated. "It's creepy," he said, taking a step back. "Don't you think?" "No, it's stunning," she replied, her hand reaching out to touch the frame. "Imagine this in our hallway. It would be such a statement piece." Inside the glass, I screamed. My mouth moved, my fists pounded against the invisible barrier, but there was no sound. The void swallowed my cries, leaving nothing but the faintest ripple in the surface of the mirror. I could see them so close and yet impossibly far. My hollow eyes stared out, desperate to warn them, to stop them. They didn't see me. They couldn't. "I'll give you a good deal on that one," the shopkeeper said, appearing from behind a counter. His smile was thin, his eyes darting nervously to the mirror as if he couldn't bear to look at it for too long. "It's an old piece, one of a kind." The woman's eyes lit up. "We'll take it." "Are you sure?" her partner asked, his unease palpable. He glanced at the mirror, his brow furrowed. "There's something off about it." The shopkeeper's hands tightened briefly on the counter, but his practiced smile didn't falter. "It's just an old mirror. Nothing to worry about," he said quickly. "It'll clean up beautifully." I thrashed against the glass, my silent screams growing more frantic as they nodded and handed over cash. The shopkeeper wrapped the mirror carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he passed it to the couple. They didn't notice. They were too busy imagining where it would hang, how it would look in their home. As they carried the mirror out of the shop, the glass caught the light for just a moment, reflecting their smiling faces alongside mine. For a fleeting second, the woman paused, her head tilting as though she had seen something in the depths of the glass. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Her partner laughed nervously. "See what?" She hesitated, staring into the mirror, but whatever she thought she had seen was gone. She shook her head. "Nothing, just a trick of the light." The door closed behind them, the bell above it jingling softly, and just like that, the mirror was gone, carried out into the world to begin again. Inside, I stood motionless, my hollow eyes watching as they disappeared from view. My reflection stared back at me, twisted and silent, a face among the countless others etched into the frame. The entity's work wasn't done, and neither was mine. Somewhere someone else would see the mirror, someone else would feel its pull, and someone else would take my place. But then what would become of me?